You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Our Canadian neighbors to the north offer us an interesting thought experiment, helping us Americans sometimes better understand ourselves. We are, of course, we Americans and Canadians, very similar in a lot of ways. Similar histories, similar people, similar outlook on life. Oftentimes, foreigners cannot distinguish the difference between an American or Canadian. Heck, for that matter, oftentimes Americans can't distinguish the difference between an American or Canadian. And yet there are important underlying differences that make our nations unique, and that certainly make the great American conservative project of trying to conserve the American founding something that would be both foreign to Canadian society, and yet something that Canadian conservatives could probably find some things that they agree with. I'm your host, Josh Lewis, and I was thrilled to find earlier this year that there is actually a Canadian Saving Elephants counterpart, if you will, Shawn Whatley, who himself is trying to explore a lot of the same themes we do here on Saving Elephants, but from his Canadian perspective. What is Canadian conservatism? What is this relationship with classical liberalism? And what does it have to offer to the politics of today? On this episode, I have Shawn on to ask these very questions. Now, as a quick aside, here at Saving Elephants, I rarely do current events unless it's some sort of a live stream. And if you're listening to this episode on the day it drops, September 16th, it's been not yet even a week since Charlie Kirk's assassination. And even though I don't cover current events, it would just feel very strange to not acknowledge that. This conversation I recorded with Shawn took place many weeks ago, so we don't acknowledge it in the conversation. And I will save my thoughts on Kirk's assassination for a later day, because on September the 18th, on Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Central Time, I'm going to host a live stream for Saving Elephants with myself and a number of other excellent panelists. Shawn Whatley actually will be one of them, as we discuss not only our thoughts on the assassination of Charlie Kirk, but the very important issue of what exactly do we do to combat political violence. So please join us on Thursday, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I'll have links in the show note how you can find that. But with that, I give you my conversation with Shawn Whatley.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
I am fascinated by the differences and stark similarities between our respective countries, right? The United States of America, where I dwell, and you in deep in the heart of Canada. And I sort of suspect that the United States, we kind of have this view that we are the world. And so I think it's harder sometimes for us to understand everyone else than for everyone else to understand us. Maybe that's simply because Hollywood is so expansive beyond the U.S. borders. So I want to start with, admittedly, a very broad question, but I just want to start here. What is a Canadian? What is it that Americans do not understand about Canadians?
Yeah, so two great questions. What is it that Americans don't understand? That might be easier to answer. I've been spending the last several years speaking to Canadian thinkers and politicians, journalists, those kinds of people, trying to answer that question. Well, what exactly is a Canadian? What holds us together? What's the basis of our stickiness? So that's a more difficult question to answer. But as far as how are we different from Americans, or what do Americans not understand? I'm going to get in trouble no matter how I answer this question. I'm going to upset the Canadians and I'm going to upset the Americans. My wife is dual citizen, so we have family all across the states.
Oh,
And yeah, so I'm going to upset everyone. And so I'll try to start with as positive a picture as possible. 75% of our trade is with America. So we basically, if America doesn't exist, Canada doesn't exist, right? We're back into fishing and trapping, and we'd really have to figure out a way to ramp up our economy in a big hurry. We share a culture, share a language, we wear the same clothes, we watch the same movies, we vacation in the same places, we eat the same kind of foods. We have similar kinds of stories from rural living, a big city living, even in snowy areas, America's got a ton of snowy areas too. Uh, Toronto is the fourth largest city in North America now after Mexico City, LA, New York, and
I
then
did
Toronto.
not know that.
Yeah, so
Wow.
we're bigger than Chicago, and that's just Toronto proper. When you look at the GTA, we're up around 9 million people. So although we would love to say how radically different we are than America, there's a ton of similarities. Having said that, if we want to get to bragging, I had Preston Manning on. He was leader of the Reform Party in Alberta, and Albertans are known for their bit of wild and craziness, kind of a populist vibe. And he went on a rant on how wonderful Canada is and how we're distinctively different than America. It's kind of bragging, but there's great opportunity to know about, Canadian resources. We're one of the largest stockpiles of natural resources in the world, perhaps besides Russia, largest forestry, mining, and fishing resources in the world, again, perhaps besides Russia, longest coastline in the world, 1.5 times longer than America. And if we want to get to bragging rights about, joining World War One 3 years before America, and joining World War Two 3 years, and so that, but really, in perspective, I mean, I think it was the first Trudeau prime minister who said Canada, our relationship with America is like a mouse sleeping with an elephant, right? So we like to brag, but really it ends up kind of like squeaking. I think there's a lot to be grateful for when it comes to Canada, but a lot of our ability to live the way we live is because of America, right?
Mhm.
You guys do the research and development on your medications, and then we steal all the ideas and sell them more cheaply. And so I could go on and on about how we benefit from our deep, abiding, and I think robust relationship with America. So hopefully that leaves all of our audiences with something to smile about, and I haven't pissed people off too much.
I'll see if I can't um, goad an answer out of you eventually. It'll upset somebody. But um, so is it fair then to say, because, and I don't mean to leap into this immediately, we can kind of unpackage this a little later. But Trump, of course, has made a, a big deal about this whole Canada should be the 51st state of the United States, that essentially you are us. Why not just accept it? Why don't we just get this thing done? I still don't understand why 51, unless he's terribly concerned about how many liberal senators that would add. How he's landing on that number, not divided by provinces. But regardless, it's something that, for the most part, most Americans I know have a largely positive view of Canada and Canadians. Occasionally, you'll have kind of a red versus blue difference where Canada is considered to be sort of this wimpish liberal, elitist bastion, if you will. But even then, there's oftentimes a lot of acknowledgments of Alberta and other areas are basically Texas, if you will. That being said, I'm just kind of curious, like, because the United States has had an amazing history of adding, from 13 original colonies, adding a lot of states. Texas being one of those, obviously, who did so most of the time very voluntarily, because they understood themselves in a certain degree to be, we want to be American, we want to be part of this. Now, Canada's always had, from what I can tell, a very friendly relationship with us, but also a very distinct, we are not America. There's a border here. We are in fact different, and so I'm wondering, like, is there a sense in which you Canadians almost internalize or think of yourselves as being not American?
Yeah, it depends who you talk to. So if you
Hmm.
talk with one of the Laurentian elites, so the high class people who live along the St. Lawrence River and who get criticized as being the controllers of Canada, they run the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and we have all sorts of other acronyms for what CBC stands for, right? You can put in bashing and communist and Christian and all sorts of different labels for those letters. Certainly, if you talk with them, some people make their living on emphasizing how Canada is so unique and different and not American. I think if we look at the roots of the not American vibe, at least in the last 50 or 60 years, people turn to George Grant and his book, Lament for a Nation. He said that if Canada loses its conservatism, it's basically becoming American, because America is so deeply liberal in a sense of being aligned with liberalism as a political philosophy. So certainly there are deep roots and there's a pedigree for that kind of thinking. However, you mentioned Alberta. And so I grew up right in the middle of Canada, so Thunder Bay, Ontario, Northern Ontario. And when you go west of Ontario, there's an awful lot of Americanness. There's more similarity between the northern states and the Western Canadian provinces than with the northern states and the coastal states or the East Coast, or especially the East Coast. And similarly in Canada, there's less similarity between Western provinces than some of the other regions. I could sum it up this way. I've just been dying to tell you this. Preston Manning, again, I mentioned this. He was trying to get a handle on what is conservatism in Canada. I had asked him that, and I said Canada is a country of regions, and he said, "No, I love that." He said we had a conference once, and we had a panel, and we asked all these experts from across Canada, what is the essence of Canadian conservatism? And he said the guy from the East Coast said tradition. And the guy from Quebec said soft nationalism. And the guy from Ontario said business. And the guy from Alberta said revolution. And the guy from BC, so the West Coast, said polarization and being on the right side of the pole, whatever that means. So so Canada is very diverse, and I think you see a lot of that diversity in America as well, at least my sense of it. The coasts are different than the flyover country. North is different than south. There is a unification or a unifying zeitgeist, I think, at least at a superficial level, but there's also rich and abundant diversity in America. And so it's really hard to pin that down. Same with Canada. There's a lot of diversity.
So you mentioned earlier Justin Trudeau, and of course the way it was supposed to work was Trudeau was supposed to be on the outs. His party was on the outs. He'd been ruling for quite a while, but there's a new wave, right? There's a new their sentiment has turned against the left, and now we're going to issue in a very conservative government. And much like he does with everything else, Donald Trump jumps in the middle of this like a bull in a china closet and sort of, tongue-in-cheek declares trade war. Well, maybe not tongue-in-cheek, declares trade war on Canada, says it should be the 51st United States, essentially makes it sound as if our relationship economically and politically and culturally with the Canadian government and maybe the Canadian people would be different under a Trump administration in a way that could be easily perceived to be antagonistic, needlessly so. For understandable reasons, this probably did not set well with most Canadians, and as a result, much to, I think, everyone's surprise, a week prior, the Conservatives do not do so well. And there's a political aspect we can explore there momentarily, but the main reason I'm bringing this up is because here in the United States, if somebody doesn't know me and I introduce myself as a conservative podcaster, I feel like I've got to go through, I haven't worked on my elevator pitch yet to what exactly that means, because it could mean I'm radical MAGA. It could mean I'm a neocon. I mean, it can mean all sorts of things. And a person could be forgiving for saying, if I describe myself as very conservative, that tends to mean very aligned with Trump. I get the sense that where you live, maybe because of recent events, it is actually kind of easy to say, I'm a conservative, and it's not just taken for granted you could be a Trump skeptical conservative. Is that a fair statement? Do you enjoy a sort of you can enjoy the purity of the term because of recent events?
I don't think it's as bad as the situation you find yourself in the States. As soon as you say you're conservative, yeah, you're a MAGA guy. I get it. And no, you're saying, wait a second, no, Trump. Let's have a debate about how conservative Trump actually is. So I think there is a little bit more spacing in Canada. Having said that, I planned a conference a year and a half ago, and I wanted to get to this issue. What is Canadian conservatism, right? So I picked three of my favorite people to speak, and we run the conference on Chatham House rules. So I'm not allowed to say who the speakers were, but I can say what the content was. And so we had two professors and a media guy. And the first person said, well, Canadian conservatism is really just classical liberalism. And I thought, okay, well, it's good to have diversity, right? Hopefully the next two guys will make up for this. Every speaker said Canadian conservatism is basically classical liberalism. And so I was president of this organization at the time. I ran up and I said, personal, I get the presidential privilege here. I'm going to ask the first question. I said, well, what about, our ideas about knowledge, so epistemology? What are about our ideas about what it means to be human, and how are conservative ideas different from liberal ideas? And I got a bunch of blank stares, and they thought, well, okay, good questions, but what does that have to do with anything? And and I had long debates with many of the professors of the crowds afterwards, friendly debates, right? And I'd say, come on, guys, this is like fundamentally different ideas. And that was actually one of the motivations for me starting my own blog or my own podcast, just to say, we need to dig into this. Nathan Penkovsky, I just had him on my show recently, and he said, you could advance in academia if you, quote, wear your liberalism on your sleeve, end quote. And so he said, you could even be a Catholic philosopher like Charles Taylor in Quebec. He just passed away recently, and write big books that sell quite well in the academic world if you wear your liberalism on your sleeve. And it's kind of the same in Canada. If you say you're conservative, that means you're strong on fiscal policy, you like economic liberalism, tough on crime, and really wanting people to go out and do big things, get a home, progress, and the government's not going to tell you how to live. At the same time, we'll give a small nod to social conservatism, but social conservatism won't win you a majority. So let's focus on economics and trade and maybe foreign policy a little bit. How conservative is that? I'm not sure that it is, but perhaps we can get into that a bit later in the discussion.
Yeah, that and I think you and I have been on similar tracks for many years trying to answer this unanswerable question: what is conservatism? What is, from my perspective, what is American conservatism? And it's not unanswerable in the sense that I've not heard compelling answers. It's just I think it is. It's a term that contains so much. It's really hard to just dwell. Here's the kernel of what this actually means. But I do want to kick that over to you because you're right. You have had many guests on. I think you ask many of them the very unfair question, usually right up front: what is conservatism? Or what? Gosh, who was one of your guests? It was a woman who 30 minutes later finally got around to answering it. She's first said, well, let's start with what is the meaning of life, or what is
Yeah, that was Caitlin Ford. That was great.
Yeah, she had a great conversation, but yeah, she gave it the nerdiness it deserved, I guess, that sort of response. But so let me ask you then. I'm not necessarily going to unfairly ask Shawn to define conservatism for us, but I'm just curious, of all these guests you've had on, are there some who distill, and let me be clear here, I want to talk about conservatism as a broader concept, which is hard to define because are we conserving, 18th century Ottoman Empire, or are we conserving the United States or Canada? I recognize these things are different, but there must be some sort of underlying thread that can distinguish it from, say, a classical liberalism. And then maybe as we progress in the conversation, we could talk about, is there a distinction where you could say this is a Canadian sense of Canadian conservatism? But let me just start there with these guests you've had on. Who has encouraged you to say, or who has provided an insightful answer that you thought was a very good one to that question?
Yeah, great question. I think some of the best responses have been the quips that you hear. So Professor Tom Flanagan, who I don't think he'd call himself a conservative in a strict sense, more of an economic liberal. He might get mad at me for saying that. He doesn't get mad at anyone, but he might give me a hard time later. He said Louis Armstrong, when he was asked for a definition of jazz, said, if you need to ask me for a definition of jazz, you aren't ever going to understand jazz. And so there's an aspect of asking for a definition for things that really go beyond defining. So give me a definition of art. Give me a definition of motherhood. Give me a definition of what it means to ride a bicycle. Well, you can be an expert and write a whole textbook on the physics of riding a bicycle, but you don't understand riding a bicycle until you actually get on the bike and go for a ride. And on top of that, exactly what you mentioned, the word conservative is layered in with baggage that we bring from media and conservative political parties, and reports about conservatives in other countries resisting reform and starting rebellions because they're hardcore conservatives, and you're kind of asking yourself, what what does that word mean? And so I think that we have to sneak up to the word and ask three questions. So what kind of a thing is conservative? And we've already answered that. It's a hard thing to answer. The second thing is, what's it aimed at? And I would say conservatism is aiming at the whole of reality. It's not just about economics, it's not just about politics or ethics or culture or history or family or society. We're trying to grasp and think about all of reality. And reality is the true North Star to the ideas we come up with. And so sometimes conservatives will say, we're not about ideology, we're not about theory, we want to have our grip on reality. And so that's kind of the topic or the content that we're trying to get our heads around. David Hume used the term, a philosopher, Scottish philosopher, used the term ultimacy. We're trying to wrap all of reality into our head, and it often makes our heads explode, but we can go there as well. So what kind of thing is it? What's it aimed at? And then how is it different from the other isms? And the big other ism that we're always faced with is liberalism. And we can unpack that in a bit, but David Foster Wallace, American author, I'm not sure if you've heard him give this little story. He talks about the fish, the three fish, the two little fish, young fish, and then a big fish. They're swimming along and they pass each other. And the older big fish says to the little fish, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they swim on their way. The two little fish don't say anything. And eventually one of the little fish says to his buddy, "What the heck is water?" And that's what we're swimming in, right? We're swimming in
Yeah.
liberalism, right?
Right.
From cradle to grave, our assumptions that knowledge means propositional knowledge has to be a definition, just a whole body of assumptions about ideas and reason and human nature are all on that mindset, or we wear our liberalism on our sleeve all through education. And so you and I are trying to tackle what the heck is air, right? We're trying to get out of the
Right.
water. And okay, how do we describe that to people? Or, what does color look to someone who's colorblind? So that's a non-answer. I apologize. And I'll end with this. Roger Scruton said, conservatism is a work of rescue. And conservative intellectuals look for reasons for people who don't need reasons. So a lot of people know the stuff that you and I are trying to wrap our minds around and put language to. When people know that by instinct, they know what they love. They know that you shouldn't drive over a mother duck and her ducklings in the springtime. They know that they're born with obligations to their friends and or to their family, rather, to their parents and their siblings. So everything's not voluntary. So all these big, giant political, cultural ideas are known to most people, and they don't need to have them explained and proven to them. But you and I find ourselves in this situation because the folks on the other side of the aisle, the folks in the water, are on TV and they're in academia and they're in politics. And so we're kind of on our back foot saying, well, I shouldn't have to explain this to you, but okay, I'll try.
I'm kind of fleshing this idea out as I'm going here, so see if this makes sense to you or not. But I wonder sometimes if part of the complexity, because it seems like the conservatives' natural disposition is to be against classical liberalism until they encounter a non-conservative against classical liberalism, and then they defend classical liberalism. And so I wonder sometimes if the incongruity there is because we kind of have a category error between the two things. Now, don't get me wrong, there's obviously a lot of overlap where conservatism and classical liberalism can be seen as ideologies, political movements, they can be seen as temperaments, and you can compare or contrast them as such. But as you said earlier, right, and I do agree, I think conservatism is really pointed at the whole of reality. And I would say also because it's doing that, it is necessarily less specific, right? Less programmatic, less systematic than, say, something like a classical liberal could be. And so sometimes it seems like it's unfair to say that the liberal, and maybe we could say the progressive or classical liberal, is the opposite of the conservative. Rather, they sort of stay in these two different realms. And the role of the conservative is often to encourage the classical liberal to stay in their lane instead of trying to absorb all of reality into this very limited tool of liberalism. What do you think about that? Does that fit for you?
Oh no, I shouldn't have jumped in, but that you were just on a roll. That you very well said they try to fit everything into the reality that they're defining. I've got a lot of use, and this is just brand new for me. So over the last couple of weeks, I ran across George Grant's essay called "In Defense of Liberalism." No, "In Defense of North America," not "In Defense of Liberalism." "In Defense of North America," and it's the first chapter in his book "Technology and Empire." He wrote it in 1969. People who are familiar with that name, George Grant, they might say, "Oh, he's a red Tory, so he's kind of a communist guy who likes the monarchy." Yeah, couldn't be further from the truth. He's a philosopher and a theologian. But when he's talking in that chapter about In Defense of North America, he's trying to get into the mindset of our North American sensibility. Why is liberalism so natural for us? Why do conservatives come out and say, "Oh yeah, no, we're trying to conserve classical liberalism"? And he's trying to unpack this, and he's wrestled with it for decades. And he starts out by saying, we don't have the European past. We don't have medieval structures all around us. And our experience in settling our young countries, both of our countries are very young, was number one, our experience with the land, and the land could kill us, right? If you didn't have a good harvest, you starved. If you didn't clean your chimney, your house burnt down from a chimney fire. If you didn't have a gun, you were eaten by a bear, or your kids were eaten by a bear. Perhaps more so in Canada, but certainly this is very much reality. I'm 1970, so Generation X. Even in the 1970s, it was pretty rugged, woolly existence in Northern Ontario. If your car broke down on the side of the road in the middle of the winter, a plow truck may not be coming by. You better have blankets in the car because, minus 30 Fahrenheit is minus 30 at Fahrenheit and Celsius, I think, are the same, or maybe it's minus 40. Anyways, it's freaking cold.
They're both cold, yeah.
Yeah, it's like well below 0 Fahrenheit, well below 0 Celsius. And this is reality, right? You were nature was wonderful, but it was scary. It was something you had to fight against. So he said that's one aspect. The second aspect, he said, was the fact that especially the pioneers, they were Protestants, largely Protestants, but a particular kind of Protestants. He said they were Calvinists. And this gets maybe a little too nerdy, but both strains of the Calvinist theologians who said we don't want to talk about fancy, highfalutin, scholastic reasons. We just want to be really basic and get people focused on, the fundamentals in their Christian faith. And we can unpack that if you want, but just kind of a stripped down Protestant Christianity. Bare bones churches, a white building, hard pews is kind of a real, almost a harsh kind of approach to their faith. And at the same time, they found a lot of resonance with the scientists that were coming up in the 17th century that said, "Stop talking to us about Aristotle. We don't want to talk about final and formal forms or causes, a final formal cause or a final cause. We just want to focus on material and efficient causes. We want to be able to control nature. So stop talking to us about all this scholastic thought." And so both the scientists and the theologians, right at the time when America and Canada were being founded, were armed with this repudiation or a pushing away of the contemplative life. So we're not going to think deeply about, grand ideas about reason or the true, the good, and the beautiful, and all these wonderful philosophical ideas. And George Grant calls this our primal spirit or our primal. This is the primal spirit of the North American sentimentality. And so this is part of the reason why people like you and I find it difficult to, we're essentially trying to rediscover that contemplative nature of human existence. And Grant says it was there. We all still have friends and we have enjoyments and we have a sense of virtue, honor, whatever virtues we follow. And so the contemplative is there, but it was very underdeveloped because as pioneers, you had to work from sunup to sundown, and if you didn't, you might starve to death. And so I would encourage you to check out that chapter. I found it really, really helpful for unpacking this difficult question that you've just asked.
You're describing a lot within the broader context of, say, Canadian conservatism. So or I'm sorry, rephrase that. North American, I guess, sentiments, or not even conservatism, but just who we are as North Americans. The great advent that separates our country, of course, was the Revolutionary War of Independence here in the United States, that we declare all men are equal. And it's messy. It's just like both of our countries are complex. The comedian Jim Gaffigan says you have the great Virginians like Washington and Jefferson waxing eloquent about all men are created equal. And then the Massachusetts colony gets a hold of that and says, hey, we heard what you guys said about rights and liberty and justice and equality, and we really like that, so we just went ahead and started a war with England. So it's kind of this dual nature of this cerebral contemplation, if you will, but also the action and the very grisly action of starting a war in order to enact these things. This is something that I, as an American conservative, have to wrestle with. Because on the one hand, in order to be, broadly speaking, a conservative in the United States, you almost have to be pro-founding era, right? That's what we're conserving in a sense. But then you get into this bizarre, so are we conserving a revolution? Because that sounds like an oxymoron, right? And so then you get to the further question, well, is it a revolution in traditional sense? I don't think it was like, say, the French Revolution. I don't think we're trying to undo society and redefine human nature. It was almost I like that phrase used from Scruton. He has such great pithy phrases, a rescuing, if you will, of what we understood our rights to be, sacred rights to be as English subjects of the crown. That was not the view of the Canadians, though. It was, and by Canadians, I mean those that chose to go north when the war started, because they're like, nope, we're sticking with Great Britain. And so I'm curious then, because here I think we end up with a breach that you have to distinguish. There must be something different between the American and the Canadian conservative that would have to take that origin point, say, into consideration, because we have to defend the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Declaration of Independence, and these things that separate us from a people, whereas I would almost say, kind of evolved in a separation from the British monarch, but are still part of it and founded your conservatism within that. And this is going to sound clumsy, but I'll say a simpler understanding of what a conservative path would be, right? Here's what we have, let's develop from it, rather than let's make a radical break from it and try something new. How would you distinguish, say, a Canadian conservative from your counterpart, such as myself? Like, is that origin story enough of a difference to say these are two very distinct traditions and they should be treated as such?
Yeah. So I'm not sure. Are you a follower? I'm sure you've heard of Yoram Hazony and National
Oh, yeah.
Conservatism, that whole, yeah. And I guess I'd riff off the things that he's been saying, and certainly many others have said the same thing. That Edmund Burke, for example, the great British statesman, was a booster or a supporter of the American Revolution. He said, no, you guys go for it. You are standing up for the rights of Englishmen, and shame on the crown for treating you that way. He was unequivocally opposed to the French Revolution, just as you said, and for the reasons that you identified.
Which is why there are statues of Burke in Washington, D.C. and not in Paris.
Fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know that. Very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. Burke's a weird guy too. I mean, he said a lot of weird things. All these old guys are weird. We're going to be weird. My kids already say I'm weird, so there you go. But as you were asking your question, it made me think, and I believe maybe I've got this line from the series The Crown, right? I don't know if you've watched that. My family likes watching that series on, I think it's on Netflix. But at one point, the Queen in there said, we learned to deal with our colonies differently after the American Revolution. We learned something there. And I wish we had done it differently. I forget how the authors or the writers of that script put it, but basically the gist was, geez, we could have done something differently. And if you look at the pattern of how they dealt with their colonies and the succession after the American Revolution. It's markedly different. And so Canadians like to brag that, oh, we separated from the mother country without a shot being fired. Well, yeah, that's because Britain had learned a heck of a lot. And the British subjects in America had said, no, you can't treat us like that. That is wrong. So I think that's a partial answer. I've heard other people answer it in the way that, from an economic point of view, Canada was settled in large part on an economic basis, right? The fur trade, that I've heard that the Northwest Company was, in terms of size, kind of on the relative size of Google or Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
They're just giant, wealthy countries. And so they wanted to have some law and order. And when we settled the West and the prairies, we didn't do it in a cowboy fashion because that would disrupt our economic stability and our trade routes. And so they wanted the crown to be in there and the Mounties to have law and order and keep things straight. I'm getting way above my pay grade, though, to even mention that. I mean, these are
Sure.
things that I've heard, but I think there are a number of ways to unpack that, and I hope that's a partial answer to a very complex question that you've asked.
It is, and I think that's one of the brilliances of Burke is he understood, India and Ireland and Canada and the United States and Great Britain are not the same thing, and he understood how those complexities entered into political arrangements and discussions and decisions. And I am a huge fan. He's probably the closest I'll come to saying that's the central figure I try to look for in a conservative philosopher, in that he disavowed the French revolutionaries. What was? Am I going to get this right? Let me think here. He talks about the revolutionaries' idea, or the Jacobins' idea of liberty, equality, as these abstractions that, where they are metaphysically correct, they are practically that's their practical defect or something to that effect. And it was almost like he's saying, look, it's not that I'm arguing with you guys about is liberty a virtue, should the state uphold these things. It's that the practical application of it is not something you can just declare like Michael Scott declares bankruptcy, right? You can't just shout this and somehow that changes things. And I think that was Burke's brilliance, is recognizing that humanity is not, oftentimes where the left wants to put it, complicated. It's complex. It's not a math problem. It's an organism that is intertwined, and it's not a problem to be solved. It is something that you allow it to grow, and you try to massage at the edges.
So when you were searching for that quote, and I apologize, I know the quote you're thinking of, but I don't have it memorized.
It's just
but
beautifully stated. I can't remember it exactly.
Yeah, it reminded me of another quote that I use all the time. And Edmund Burke said, we need to avoid the, quote, nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction. And, the other favorite quote is, the glory of Europe is ended and the age of chivalry is gone. And, that of economists, sophisters, and economists, calculators, and sophists. And anyways, I've butchered the quote that I love so much, but the one about the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction, I think, is really key for us to understand, especially in our day and age. So our current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, wrote this very thick book called Value, and then he's got brackets around the S, so values. And essentially, he's talking about these wonderful values that he gets to define based on whatever he thinks they should be. And now he has the power to impose them on us. And I think that's the sort of thing that Edmund Burke was worried about. And he was willing to say, okay, yes, let's get some law and order in India. And look what we're doing to our own soldiers by what we've asked them to do. They are going to be useless for doing anything when they come home. That is wrong. So he could say yes, but, or yes, however, look what we're doing. And so there was this strong element of prudence in it all. And Ferenc Horscher, the Hungarian philosopher I've had on my show, he wrote a whole book about conservatism as prudence and how we need to have a sense of tactfulness when we're dealing with these specific situations. The word tactfulness, actually, he's getting from another philosopher, Hans Gadamer, but this sense that we're, again, touching on reality. What is actually going on? what's happening in these people's hearts and minds? How are we bending these people out of shape so that they're useless for any other work? What are we doing to Americans by forcing them to pay taxes and we're not doing anything for them in return? Oh, they revolt. Guess what? No kidding. We would too if we were there. So, yeah, I echo your applause for Burke. I think he got a lot of things right. However, he's an old author, right? It's hard to read him sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I mentioned, I guess it was when we were in the green room having a conversation with a Straussian. I like, although the individual I had on, Stephen Hayward, is actually one of the most amicable Burkean Straussians you'll run into, because he's, he I think he gets Burke very well. But that's one of those things we have to brilliant people debate even today. What did this guy actually mean? Because he was so non-specific in the thing. He was always, or I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. He was always specific. He was never, it was always, concrete. It was never abstract. And so it makes it hard to talk about Burke abstractly. Let me steer us back toward classical liberalism, rather, because I had mentioned I wanted to kind of unpackage that a little more. You had written, just bits and pieces from what I can tell, that you had written, liberalism itself is failing. It fails because it succeeds. Liberalism cannot fix the failings of liberalism. I guess I have kind of a two-part question here, because you mentioned earlier Yoram Mazzoni. I think up until this point of the conversation, the listener could be forgiven for saying, well, is Shawn in the nationalist camp? Is he the Patrick Deneen variant? It mentions he's a traditionalist. He likes Burke, but I know that, Deneen and Yoram Mazzoni do too. But in that second piece there, liberalism cannot fix the failings of liberalism, sort of implies, kind of going back to that idea that conservatism is rescuing, that liberalism needs rescuing. Whereas if I understand, and I hope I'm not doing him injustice, but a Patrick Deneen version of liberalism is that it's rotten from the root down, right? That it is in fact liberalism that is the problem and ought to be replaced with some alternative. Whereas a traditional conservative such as myself sees part of the role of conservatism is rescuing liberalism.
Yeah.
So where would you chart yourself on that map? Do you see liberalism as an unalloyed evil that ultimately needs to be, that conservatism is there to root out? Or is it a very messy thing that we're there to cultivate and try to help survive?
Yeah. Great question. I like to see the glass half full, and maybe you can accuse me of having rose-colored glasses. Although some of my friends say, "Shawn, you're too pessimistic. The world is not going to hell in a handbasket." Stop talking about the Western civilization crashing and burning. And so there is an element of that in me as well. But your question about liberalism, I think it's reasonable if we start with an appreciative inquiry and say, what is good about liberalism? And Roger Scruton, in one of his books, he said, the good of socialism, the good of liberalism.
Yeah.
Every chapter is started that way, and then he, of course, trashes each one of these isms that he hates. So we'll start with the good, and then we'll trash it. But liberalism is brilliant when it rests on a thick social fabric. So the brilliance of liberalism is its simplicity. It's a very thin philosophy. And I'm drawing on Francis Fukuyama, sort of the great modern prophet of liberalism, the great defender of liberalism. And he describes 4 features of liberalism. And actually the 4 features he gets from John Gray's work. John Gray is a British philosopher, and he wrote his essay with those 4 features back in the 1990s. So I wanted to mention John Gray because if you ever get a chance to read Enlightenment's Wake, it's a collection of essays from the 1990s by John Gray. I think you'll just love it. And he was thinking about these issues of post-liberalism long before it became a thing to talk about in the last 10 years. But John Gray said that liberalism is these 4 things, and Fukuyama quotes him. He says it's a focus on the individual, so individualism, egalitarianism, so we're all the same. We might say we're all the same, created equal before the law or equal in the eyes of God. Universalism, and this is the sticky part where we really start differentiating ourselves from conservative and liberal. So universalism, something is true everywhere around the world, right?
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal is a universal statement.
Yes, and so we can go bomb Iraq and set up universal
Right.
democracy there. So universalism, and then meliorism, which is just a $10 word for saying we can fix government. We can make all these social structures much better. And just because they exist, who cares that we inherited them? Who cares that they're several thousand years old? We can do better. We can make it better. Well, those four ideas are brilliant if we have a robust sense of social fabric to uphold those ideas. So if you and I both grow up in a family where our moms say, smarten up, say thank you, stand in line, don't drive over the ducklings when they walk across the road in the spring, or all the millions of things that we learn from our moms or our community or our congregation or our sports team or at school. So we have a rich social fabric that has a set of obligations and expectations. That's a better word. Has a set of expectations for what it means to be a good American or a good Canadian. Then liberalism works really well. But as soon as that social fabric starts to fray or we draw down on it, some people use the analogy of a bank account. A social fabric is a bank account that we inherit. And if we draw down on it without making deposits and reminding people that, hey, this is what it means to be a good hockey player. You show up for practice, you work hard, you don't complain, you listen to the coach, whatever sport you play. Every sport, every community has a set of expectations for the people who are part of that community. Unless those expectations are being built and people are reinforced, that's the word, unless they're being reinforced, then that fabric starts to fray. And pretty soon your hockey team looks like a bunch of hosers who never practice and don't listen to each other and don't get along very well, and they don't win games, right? They make it have a lot of fun fighting, but they don't really perform well and excel. And that's what's happening with our country. We can't be sheepish about actually delivering a positive set of expectations. And this is where conservatives get really uncomfortable, especially given our primal spirit of liberalism, right? No, just don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. I don't want to tell them to do anything. And so we get antigens, or we have hives. We have an allergic reaction against daring to tell people that this is what we hope you would do. This is what we expect you to do as being a good American. And that's the challenge for us right now as the non-left or conservatives, if you hold that label, is how are we going to start telling our millennials, like your whole podcast is about, how are we going to form our friends in a friendly, attractive, aspirational way, and not in a negative, school marmies wagging our finger kind of way. Don't do this, don't do that. No, do this. This is what it means to be part of the team. This is what's going to help our team win championships. And you're going to have a lot of fun doing it. That's the message we need to figure out, and figure out how to do it in a way that isn't feeling shameful of the criticism and attack that we're going to get from our classical liberal and libertarian friends.
So one of the great divides on the, I guess what we could call the non-liberal group, of course, is there's a variety of answers to, they would all agree with what you just said and then have really different ideas of, okay, well, how do we do that? One of those answers, the more nationalist populist, maybe I could say Patrick Deneen, but I don't want to pick on him too much, that there is a variant that says, look, we're not libertarians. We enjoy classical liberalism, but I agree it's a thin, simplistic view that only rests upon a thick culture that's working. And if the culture is not working, well, we got to do something about that. Which, personally, I agree. Yeah, we got to do something about that. So what do? Is the state, or to what degree is the state, an instrument that helps reinvigorate this culture, right? Is the goal for the right to take over the state in the same way that the progressive left attempts to try to get an end result that they want to in the sort of society we want to build? Or is there an aspect in which, let me put it this way, as a traditionalist conservative myself, I think it is just a given that we all have a concern with this idea that libertinism is insufficient to keep classical liberalism running. If you don't have functional families and churches and institutions, and if you're not teaching to be polite and to work within society, and those institutions that do that aren't working, it's not going to work. But then the divide comes, okay, well, what do you do when things start to break down? Because, I don't know how common it is in Canada, but here in the United States, it's on the right, know what time it is. He's a conservative that knows what time it is. And what that phrase typically means, and quite frankly, I think knowing what time it is an important thing. I think it's both biblical, and there are people who, Churchill knew what time it was, Lincoln knew what time it was. But what they tend to mean by it is the left is so far gone and this thing is so hopeless that we can't play by the same old rules we used to. We now have to use the instrument of the state for our purposes to get people to behave in a way that we want them to. I am rather skeptical that the state is capable of doing that. Now, that may put me in the pessimistic lot. Well, if the state can't do it, maybe nobody can if our institutions are truly broken. And so I'm just kind of curious there. What do you... Because it sounds like you're grabbing for here's what we need to do, but it also sounds like you're kind of like me, which is I don't have a 10-point plan that I can hand you and say, I know that this will work if you just put me in charge. So what do you do in the face of that lack of, say, state control that could solve this problem?
Yeah, big, huge question. And I mean, that's the main question that I think conservatives who are in politics especially are facing right now. And that's why they end up just talking about economics, because they can't they can't solve this very difficult question that you've just asked. A partial answer, and again, anything I say is going to be a partial answer, very, very difficult to figure out. I think number one, we need to say it doesn't have to be spooky. So we're not talking about coming up with purity tests and running around and forcing people to do X, Y, and Z. No, it's not spooky. When we're talking about expectations, it's very, very simple and normal. So if you work in an office where you always start meetings late, then you have a culture of lateness. The expectations within your office is that, don't show up at 9 because the meeting's not even going to get started probably till 9:15. So go get your coffee. Anyways, you've been in offices like this. When a new boss comes in and says, "Hey guys, I know, we've had a tradition of starting at 9:15. We're starting at 9 now because we've all made time for this. We're going to start at 9. We're going to finish exactly at 10. We're going to follow the agenda. The agenda is going to be circulated a week ahead of time." Anyways, you get the sense of where I'm going. And you might say, well, that person has their knickers in a knot, or, they need to, whatever analogy you want to use to say relax a bit. Well, relaxing a bit is pursuing a particular set of expectations for that office environment. And you are setting the culture of that office environment. You are setting the expectations for the people who work in that office. And in a sense, you're changing the kind of people that they are. And you and I have worked in different offices, or I assume you have. Maybe you're self-employed and you've never worked with anybody else in your life. But people who've worked with other people, you can feel it right away. Okay, wow. In this office, I come on time. I don't wear a jeans and a t-shirt. I actually have to wear lace-up shoes. And I stay half an hour past, or there is no quitting time, right? You stay till it's dark until the boss goes home. And now you might say that's oppressive. That's terrible, Shawn. Who would ever want to work that way? Well, you know what? You get paid a lot of money there and you progress and you learn a lot and you work with really cool, smart people. Okay, now you want to work there. But it's a long way of saying that these expectations aren't spooky and they're not weird, but they are part of what defines the culture, and then which that in turn changes the nature of the people who are there. And so I believe, I forget which Greek philosopher said this, but you change the laws, you change the regime, you change the regime, you change the souls of the people living in that regime. And so we need to not be sheepish about saying laws matter. And again, right away, my libertarian friends will say, no, Shawn, you're being an authoritarian collectivist. You're communist adjacent, right? And I say, hang on. I'm talking about something simple like stoplights, right? You have stoplights everywhere around the world. And only in certain countries will people actually see stoplights as legitimate, and they stop at the stoplights and they wait until they change color, even in the middle of the night when there's no traffic around, or at least hopefully they do most of the time. And so that environment requires at least some enforcement now and then. It needs a basic law on the books. And it gets us into the very difficult area of how do we actually write laws? But this is a wonderful opportunity for conservatives to step up and say, you know what, writing laws is brutally hard. I hear you, my libertarian friend. I agree with you. We should uphold the concept of the rule of law and not legal instrumentalism, where we try to write a law to solve every social program, right? That's what the left tries to do. But there's a great opportunity and a rich history for people in our camp, the conservative camp, to say, well, we've got 800 years of history trying to nail down how do we come up with laws? Why is the common law better? And America and Canada both share this, the British common law approach, where we have precedents to develop the decisions or guide the decisions that we make now that are legal decisions. So when people say, well, you're just going to come up with an arbitrary list of do's and don'ts that sound a lot like a totalitarian approach, you say, no, that's not that we're saying. Where has that ever been a conservative approach to lawmaking or upholding peace, order, and good government? Those are the favorite words in Canadian conservative circles, where we say, we're emphasizing peace, order, and good government, as opposed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on the American side. Right?
So I'm wondering here, if we look for just a moment at Canadian politics specifically, not conservatism, not progressivism or classical liberalism. In the United States, of course, the traditionalist conservative can often point to someone, say, well, Ronald Reagan, that is an example of a conservative administration. United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, of course. Help me, an ignorant American, understand what is sort of the shorthand in Canadian politics for, even if we have never had it exactly, here is that individual or the party or the idea that we're trying to shoot for that would institute some kind of a conservative politics.
Yeah, great question. And when you say ignorant American, I'm like, yeah, right, buddy. That's a humble brag there, but I'm calling you out on that. That's the farthest thing from true. But so in the same way that you could say, well, let's look at Reagan and say, he's definitely a conservative in the last 100 years, or Thatcher. There are different individuals that you can point to and say, well, they are the embodiment of conservatism. So in Canada, you might say Sir John A. Macdonald, first Prime Minister of Canada. He definitely was a conservative. Well, actually not. He was a liberal conservative. And so he might have been somewhere in the middle. You look at Diefenbaker, a lot of the middle of Canada and west, the prairie provinces, they loved Deef the Chief, right? Well, he was kind of a populist, monarchist, rabble rouser. He'd get party documents from the Conservative Party. If he didn't like them, he'd put them in a canoe and tell the media that, hey, watch me, and he'd paddle out in the lake and throw all the documents in the water. His own party
sounds like an American conservative.
That's right. He was Trump before Trump existed. So he was a crazy man, but people loved him, and he stood for the little guy. And I think when you talk about someone who loves freedom, he was the guy who came up with the famous line, what is the nationality that Canada has? And he says, our nationality is freedom, and freedom is what we stand for. So you could point to someone like that. You could point to a neoconservative like Brian Mulroney in the 80s, in the North American Free Trade Act, and big proponent of free trade. And we could ask, well, what kind of conservative is that, right? How does that protect a local economy, local communities, local industry? So your question is tricky because it kind of gets to the heart of, again, what is conservatism? And conservatism is, I think, at its root, the prudential application of a policy based on some guiding principles. And some of those big guiding principles start with things like, what is our idea about knowledge? And very concretely, can we simply rely on our brains and our ability to think things out? Or do we need to have humility and say, you know what, even when I can get to an answer, it's often wrong or I misapply it. So I need those several hundred years or 2,000 years of trial and error as a textbook to look at and say, oh, yeah, Josh tried that there 300 years ago and failed. Shawn tried that there 200 years ago and failed. So why don't we be kind of cautious about what we're going to do here in this particular situation? So that's a different epistemology. It's a different base of a set of presuppositions about what knowledge is, how can we get at knowledge, what can we trust in our quest for knowledge. And that's a very different set of principles to guide us when it actually comes to putting pen to paper and writing policy. Writing policy is very, very difficult to do. I've done a fair bit of it, and some of it I look back and I just cringe. I go, oh man, how did I write that?
I wrote a little bit of policy when I was in the student body senate at College of the Ozarks, and at probably a level that is infinitely less important than what you're alluding to. And I too cringed when I thought about what I was writing. Let me ask you this, because a year or so back, I was on Nancy Duff's aptly named The Nancy Duff Show podcast. I'm sorry, not Duff, Nancy Duffy. My apologies if she's listening. I got your name wrong. She's a fellow Canadian, wonderful host, asked me a lot of great questions, and I kind of got the sense in talking with her. And this was her perspective. I don't know, maybe this is just in her general area, but she kind of described Canadian politics looked across the big pond of the United Kingdom during Brexit and thought, boy, that's weird. And then they looked to the South in 2016 with the rise of Donald Trump's, thought, okay, this is weird. And for quite a while, sort of carried on in the old world that the UK and the United States used to be in, right? We had fights, but they were normal. They weren't that bizarre. And then along comes COVID. And she kind of described it as that was almost, I don't know that were her words, but like the Americanization of Canadian politics. Is that a fair description? Were you guys sort of looking across the pond into your South thinking, well, thank God we haven't gone off the deep end, but now you've joined us in the past several years?
Oh, we went crazy during COVID, no question. And we'd love to blame it on Americans, and we'd love to blame it on BLM riots, and on AOC. And you pick a label, and we were very happy to blame someone else for it. But it's endemic. It's not endemic. It's homegrown. What's the word for it? It's a native thing that comes within us, and we can't blame anyone else for it. I think it's a combination of that primal spirit I talked about before. George Grant mentioned, you've got a pattern of avoiding contemplation and focusing on what's practical. How can we get technological mastery of the world around us? So that's the scientific side. And then on the faith side, how can we strip things down bare bones? Don't talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful. Just talk about how to get saved and be a good Christian. Well, that Calvinist theology is gone pretty much in Canada now. It's fizzled up completely. The scientific side, or the desire for mastery and control of nature, is still there. So that strong secular liberalism is still very much there. And I would say that that's present across the political spectrum. And really what we're arguing about now is how to apply it in a policy environment. So even within the non-left, or certainly within the Conservative Party, you had strong disagreements on what position we should take on the science says, right? Or we should do, social distancing. And actually, I'm on record. I'm a Monk Senior Fellow in Health Policy at the McDonald-Laurier Institute. And I wrote a number of op-eds on literature from around the world and how things were being applied in different countries who were doing sometimes better and sometimes worse than us, by doing sometimes the same things as us and some things radically different. Basically,
Right.
we didn't know what the heck was going on.
Yeah, nobody knew what was going on.
And so the arrogance in that, but again, that speaks to epistemology, to knowledge, right? How do we know what we know? And how do we translate what we know into policy? And how do you have a modicum of humility within that? If I can get myself in trouble a bit with respect to conservatives, and feel free to throw this back at me and disagree. But it seems to me that conservatives in America and in Canada share the presupposition that what matters most is economics. As long as we get our economics right, the rest of society is going to be okay. We'll have strong families and vibrant communities and wonderful industry and peace, order, and law if we have strong economics. Well, the person who originally said that economics was the substructure of society and everything else is the superstructure was, of course, Karl Marx. Karl Marx said all that matters is economics. That's the substructure of society. So, what we have is a whole bunch of political parties sharing that presupposition that Marx argued for in the middle of the 19th century, and with varying degrees of Keynesianism. So, the idea that the government can work it all out and really smart people can manage the economy for us. And if we just do that well, life will be good. And I'm getting this from Roger Scruton. He said, that is fundamentally wrong. That presupposition doesn't hold true. And that was one of his main criticisms of Margaret Thatcher. I love Thatcher, love the Iron Lady. Many of the things she did were instinctively conservative. However, she fell prey for this basic presupposition that the most important thing in the world today is economics. And if we get economics right, everything else will work out. I would say that's fundamentally not a conservative position to hold. You need other things to be right before you can get good economics. And those of us who've worked in companies, or certainly if we held leadership positions, especially in knowledge workers, you need to motivate them from a different position than just saying, hey, I'll give you an extra $100 if you stay late. You need to reward their creativity and acknowledge their hard work and give them respect and give them the opportunity to grow. There's all sorts of intrinsic motivators, especially for knowledge workers. And simply talking about how much money you give them or how much more you're going to claw back or how much pay at risk. They came up with a pay at risk scheme when I was working as a hospital administrator. I said, you can't be serious. Yeah, my pay is already at risk just by the fact I'm doing this job. I could go back to seeing patients and do far better. You put anything at risk, man, I'm gone. Your risk of losing me altogether. And they said, oh, yeah. Okay, good point. So it's those sorts of things that we need to be doing to push back against this presupposition that economics is the substructure of society. And both left and right, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, everybody makes the assumption. And then we simply argue around the margins on how we're going to apply that into policy. I think that's fundamentally not a conservative approach.
I think that's well said, and I would be remiss if I don't know that we'll improve upon that as a conclusion, so I think this would be a good place to wrap up. I do want to give you an opportunity, of course. You have your own show. I would happily direct the listeners or watchers there. How will they find your show? Where would they go?
Yeah, so on your favorite podcaster, they're all over the place, so they pump it out everywhere. It's just called Concepts with Shawn Whatley. I'm on YouTube. If you like to watch videos, you can find me on my website, ShawnWhatley.com. And I'd love to hear what people think. Shoot me an email. I do try to answer emails. It might not be a long reply. I'm also on Twitter or X and everywhere else too. But thanks so much for having me here, Josh. I love your show. As I was saying in the green screen before, I've been listening to you for years, and to get an email from you, I was like, wow, this guy is my hero. I can't believe I'm on his show. So thank you so much for what you do.
You're too kind. Thank you. It has been a great conversation, and thank you for taking the time to hop on the program with us.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.